Nicole Hart had never been one to rush into decisions, especially when it came to matters of personal space and peace of mind. After years of navigating chaotic city life and juggling a demanding academic schedule, she craved the kind of silence that didn't just fill a room but absorbed into the skin, like balm. That craving had brought her to a modest but elegant single-story house on the edge of a planned community, nestled between a patch of preserved woodland and an unfinished golf course. She wasn't the owner. Her lease was through a reputable property management firm and legally bound for 18 months. But she treated the home with a sense of stewardship that could rival any longtime resident's attachment. The house had a clean, modern layout with tall windows, a gently sloping backyard bordered by pine trees, and an old wooden gazebo at the edge of the lot that smelled faintly of cedar and history. It was perfect for her field workshops. She was a senior lecturer in urban policy at the university, and also ideal for moments when she simply needed to disconnect from the academic machine and sit in the quiet hum of nature. The neighborhood was more structured than she would have preferred. It had committees, rules about lawn maintenance and mailbox uniformity, and people who greeted each other with performative smiles that lasted just long enough to pass judgment behind them. Nicole wasn't a stranger to bureaucracy. Her field thrived on dissecting it. But she had no personal interest in mingling with the local governance crowd. She paid her rent, respected the boundary lines, and kept mostly to herself, not out of misanthropy, but from a well-earned understanding that conflict was often born in the spaces between unnecessary interactions. She figured if she didn't ask anything from them, they'd offer her the same in return. Her days were structured, predictable in a way she appreciated. Wake up early, coffee by the back window, an hour of reading, virtual lectures, student meetings, then research in the afternoon. The yard became her favorite spot to unwind and occasionally conduct outdoor seminars. Her students adored the tranquil environment, far from the usual brick-and-metal harshness of the city campus. That was the rhythm. That was the unspoken agreement she had with her space, and for a time, it worked. Then came the drone. The first time she heard the low, insect-like whirring over her roof, she assumed it was a child's toy or perhaps a new neighbor testing out a hobby. She didn't look up. It passed quickly, casting a brief, jittering shadow on her patio before vanishing past the tree line. She chalked it up to a one-off incident and went back to her book. The second time it happened, just 3 days later, it lingered longer, circling with a pattern too precise to be recreational. It hovered near her office window before retreating back over the trees. By the third instance, Nicole stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the morning sun and watching the mechanical thing pirouette in the air just 20 feet above her. She tried to wave it off, literally, but the drone didn't react, didn't retreat. It remained motionless, trained toward her like an unblinking eye. Only after a full minute did it rise higher and disappear into the pale blue sky. There was something about its movement, too stable, too coordinated, that unsettled her. This wasn't someone's bored teenager, it was deliberate, and it wasn't just one drone. She began to notice the subtle indicators. Parallel tracks pressed into the dew-covered grass in her backyard one morning, faint scuff marks on the concrete tiles near the garden shed, a spike in Wi-Fi interference that disrupted her online lectures. It was happening gradually, almost subtly, like she was being tested for reaction thresholds. And for a few days, she convinced herself not to overreact, to keep documenting, to observe. But then, on a Saturday at 6:15 a.m., she opened her back door to find 3 men setting up a collapsible platform on her lawn. No knocking, no warning. They wore safety vests and carried cases marked with corporate branding she didn't recognize. One of them nodded at her as though she were the out-of-place element. When she demanded to know what they were doing on private property, she was told, calmly, even patronizingly, that her parcel had been temporarily zoned for auxiliary logistics under local cooperative ordinance agreements. She blinked at him. He said it again, this time slower, as if the sheer jargon would render it legal. Nicole immediately called the property management company. The representative on the phone was polite but clearly unaware. They promised to look into it and call her back, which of course didn't happen until much later that afternoon. In the meantime, the platform was deployed. The men connected cables to a control panel the size of a suitcase and launched 3 drones into the sky with mechanical grace. Nicole stood there, barefoot, clutching her coffee mug like a weapon, trying to process the audacity of what had just occurred. When the call finally came, it was as useless as she'd feared. The manager informed her that, as a renter, she didn't possess the legal authority to override municipal agreements or infrastructure use permits issued by the local oversight board. She asked what that board was. The line went quiet for a few seconds before the voice returned. "We don't have a specific name on file, but we've seen this type of usage before. It's often temporary. You should be fine." Should be fine. The next day, she put up small signs along her fence line. Private property, no unauthorized access. Violators will be prosecuted. By Tuesday, they had all vanished. Not removed, vanished. Even the stakes had been cleanly extracted from the soil. She tried calling the county zoning office and was told that any inquiries about aerial activity required FAA involvement and could take several weeks for a formal response. She submitted a complaint anyway, but in the days that followed, the drone launches became more frequent, more routine. She watched through her window as uniformed teams arrived at her lawn at dawn, activated the devices, took notes on clipboards, and left like clockwork. They never addressed her again. Nicole, methodical by nature, began documenting everything: photos, time logs, changes in groundware, device behavior. But she also knew that documentation alone wouldn't reclaim her space. She needed someone to care. She spoke with a friend who worked in city planning, who promised to make inquiries. She forwarded footage to the property firm. Nothing. Then, one night after returning home from campus, she found her backyard floodlights on, and beneath them, the launch platform had been replaced with a more advanced station, mounted, shielded, with a concrete base poured directly onto the ground. No notice, no warning. This was no longer experimentation. This was occupation. She spent the night rereading her lease agreement line by line. There was no clause about shared logistics or temporary cooperative usage. The only thing even vaguely related was a reference to community use coordination in the event of emergency logistics, which, according to her understanding, would be applicable only during natural disasters or evacuation scenarios, not drone deployments. Her heart pounded as she drafted a legal complaint letter, not just to the management company, but to the county registrar and aviation compliance board. She didn't feel fear so much as violation of space, of autonomy, of rights assumed but not respected. She wasn't some rogue vigilante. She was a law-abiding academic whose property was being used without consent. And for what? What unnerved her more than the drone activity was the silence. No one in the neighborhood had spoken to her, not even to ask what was going on. A few of them glanced toward her backyard when they passed by on their morning walks, but their expressions were neutral, empty. She realized something chilling. This wasn't a mistake. This was organized, sanctioned, and, worst of all, ignored. Nicole was not someone who enjoyed confrontation, but she had not come this far in life by allowing herself to be brushed aside. She would handle it carefully, legally, but she would handle it. And if the system couldn't be counted on to listen, then perhaps it needed a little help seeing. Nicole woke to the sound of heavy engines idling. It was just after 6 in the morning. The sky still painted in that diluted gray before sunrise, when the birds were quiet and the world had not yet decided to be awake. She sat up abruptly, her senses catching the unnatural rhythm of low voices outside her window. Peering through the blinds, she saw a pair of unmarked white utility vans parked just beyond her gate. Men in dark blue uniforms moved with unhurried efficiency, unloading equipment, metal rails, black crates with red handles, and bright orange pylons which they began arranging in her backyard like they were setting up for a public demonstration. She dressed in less than a minute, grabbed her phone, and walked straight out the back door. The air smelled faintly of diesel and machine oil, the grass wet beneath her feet. As she approached the workers, one of them raised a hand in a vague greeting, offering a clipboard without preamble, as though this were a scheduled service appointment she had somehow forgotten. "We'll be finished by 11, the man said. His name tag read Dan H., and his expression was blank, professional to the point of opacity. "Just calibrating the directional stabilizers and rechecking the launch matrix. You'll notice a slight increase in atmospheric noise for the next couple hours. Nothing harmful." Nicole didn't take the clipboard. "You're not allowed to be here. This is private property." Dan's tone didn't change. "We've got an authorization certificate issued by Municipal Asset Coordination. It's in the folder if you want to review it." She opened the folder. There it was, a 3-page document, stamped with language that looped back on itself. Terms like cooperative overlay, shared operational parameters, conditional utilization per standing regional order, and a property parcel number that, horrifyingly, matched her lease paperwork. Nowhere in the document did it state consent was required from the tenant. "I didn't agree to this," she said, voice low. "You're not the owner. The authorization was processed centrally," he replied, not unkindly but without any trace of concern. "If you've got an issue, you should contact the oversight office." That phrase again. She had searched for it before. Oversight office, and found nothing official. No phone number, no address. No digital footprint beyond a handful of mentions buried in local zoning archives from 5 years ago. It was like someone had gone out of their way to create a procedural ghost, something that sounded legitimate, that everyone pretended existed, but which no one could actually reach. Nicole turned around without another word and went inside, pulling her phone from her pocket with trembling hands. She called the property management firm first. They didn't answer. She left a voicemail with clipped words and a rising sense of urgency. Then she called the city clerk's office. After being transferred twice, she was told that parcel designations were managed by the regional development coordinator, who worked only on Mondays and Thursdays. This was Tuesday. She was advised to submit a formal inquiry through an online portal. Her next call was to a land use attorney she had found online the night before, recommended by a forum for tenant advocacy. The receptionist was sympathetic but firm. The next available appointment was in 12 days. Outside, the workers began laying cable. She watched from the kitchen window, her arms crossed tight against her chest. The installation was different this time. The equipment looked more permanent. She saw leveling instruments, drilled mounts, a junction box with caution stickers, and what looked like an antenna system wrapped in shrink-wrapped tubing. These weren't temporary drones for environmental survey. They were installing infrastructure, and they were doing it on her lawn. When she stepped outside again to take photos, a second worker raised a hand. "Ma'am, I'd advise you not to interfere. This is active equipment. If there's a safety breach, it'll complicate the process for everyone." She took the photos anyway. That night she didn't sleep. The platform, now a hulking steel rectangle with telescoping legs and a retractable panel system, emitted a faint blue glow that pulsed every 30 seconds like a heartbeat. The equipment never shut down. It simply powered into standby, humming like a dormant insect. The yard that once gave her peace had been invaded, transformed into a mechanical outpost for something she didn't understand. At 3 a.m, she heard the launch. She hadn't heard any movement outside, no vans, no footsteps. Just a sudden whir, a vibration that traveled through the soil, and the electric moan of something accelerating upward. She ran to the window. The platform's panels were open, and a drone, larger than the previous ones, was rising with perfect control, its red lights blinking in a deliberate sequence. It disappeared over the treetops. Then another followed. She recorded everything on her phone, hands unsteady. The next day, the property management office finally returned her call. The man on the line sounded hesitant, almost embarrassed. He said they had received formal notice from a subcontracted utility agent that Nicole's lot was temporarily designated for telemetry support infrastructure under a logistical waiver. He repeated the phrase as if it meant something. When she demanded to know how her property was reclassified without notification, the manager mumbled that the waiver had been grandfathered in under the previous owner, and as the parcel had been inactive for some time before she moved in, it had been flagged as low resistance for temporary infrastructure. Nicole felt her mouth go dry. So you're telling me someone made this decision because they thought no one would complain? I'm not saying that, ma'am. I'm just reading what's on the paperwork. She hung up without replying. She sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the floor as the implications settled like dust across her shoulders. This wasn't just inconvenience. This was a violation disguised as procedure. Her home, where she taught, ate, read, and tried to feel safe, had been reduced to a data conduit because someone decided it was easier to step on a tenant than deal with a homeowner. She called the FAA next. That conversation was more productive. She was told to file a formal airspace complaint through a verified form. The agent explained that while drones operated below a certain altitude did not always require airspace authorization, the use of unregistered platforms for sustained activity near residential structures could raise compliance issues. She filled out the form that same night. The confirmation email arrived 5 minutes later. She felt a flicker of relief. Not much, but something. 2 days later, she came home from campus to find a letter taped to her door. It wasn't an envelope, just a single sheet of thick paper, folded once, sealed with a blank red sticker. Inside was a typed message, unsigned, reading, "This property has been integrated into a regional operations matrix. Your participation is appreciated. Disruptions may result in service escalation. Please maintain safe boundaries." No letterhead, no logo, no contact information. The back was blank. Nicole stood on the porch, rereading the message under the hard afternoon light. The words "service escalation" stuck in her brain like a splinter. It was the kind of threat that hid behind legalese. Vague enough to deny, precise enough to make you question your next move. She felt the weight of it in her ribs. That night, she walked her perimeter with a flashlight and checked the ground for sensors, tripwires, anything embedded in the soil. She found nothing, but just past midnight she caught the brief flicker of infrared light across her shed door. She turned off the flashlight and crouched low. The beam returned, sweeping across the yard, narrow and clinical. Then it vanished. She didn't sleep. She barely breathed. In the morning, she called the attorney again and left a second message. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I need help," she said. "They're using my house. They're watching me, and I don't know how far they're allowed to go." By the end of the week, Nicole had started locking her backyard gate with a heavy-duty chain and an industrial padlock, an admittedly symbolic gesture, considering that whoever had been operating the drone equipment seemed to have no trouble bypassing physical barriers or ignoring illegal ones. But still, it gave her a flicker of control, a small assertion that the land beneath her feet had not yet been surrendered. She had also rearranged her home workspace, turning her desk away from the window and repositioning her standing lamp to block the sightline from the backyard. It didn't stop the sound, though. The soft mechanical stirring of devices powering up had become a part of her daily rhythm, more consistent than birdsong. Every morning at 5:47, the platform in her yard whined to life, its panels splitting open like petals, and drones lifted off one by one, slicing into the sky with an eerie silence that seemed more ominous than if they had made noise. Her calls and complaints continued, but the responses she received, when she received them, followed a familiar pattern: transfer, deferral, procedural deflection, and then silence. It was like trying to punch through layers of fog. The land use attorney finally returned her call and agreed to meet. His name was Warren Graves, and he had the dry, steady voice of someone who'd spent a lifetime talking people out of panic and into paperwork. During their meeting at a rented office in a downtown building that smelled faintly of printer toner and frustration, he asked all the right questions, took detailed notes, and told her something that both validated her fears and chilled her. The parcel designation that allowed her backyard to be used as an operations corridor was tied to a dormant clause in the local land use matrix, originally implemented for utility easements. In theory, it should have only applied to unoccupied or undeveloped parcels. In practice, someone had quietly amended the designation records 3 months prior, just before her lease began. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone had known this property would be available, knew it would be rented rather than sold, and preemptively flagged it for temporary use under a rarely scrutinized policy loophole. "This isn't a mistake," Warren said, flipping through the printouts. "It's surgical. They targeted this house. Likely because you're not the owner and because the lease is managed through a company, not an individual." When Nicole asked who they were, he didn't offer a name, just a long pause and a shrug that carried the weight of experience. "We're not dealing with a simple utility board here." That night, Nicole came home and found the lock on her backyard gate missing. Not broken, removed. The chain was coiled neatly on the ground beside it. On the gate itself, affixed with zip ties, was a laminated sign that read, "Access required, do not impede. Security response may be initiated if interference persists." She took a photo, but didn't remove the sign. Something about it, the cold, bureaucratic tone, the bold black font, the use of the word response, made her hesitate. She didn't know what kind of security they meant. Police? Private contractors? She didn't want to find out. The following morning, she was awoken not by the hum of drones, but by the sound of drilling. 2 new technicians were anchoring a fresh piece of hardware just outside the gazebo, something cylindrical with fins, surrounded by cooling rods. When she confronted them, they barely acknowledged her. One of them handed her a flyer printed on glossy cardstock with a color logo she'd never seen before. Sinris Logistics, underneath which were words that made her stomach knot. Regional Aerial Integration, Level 3 Deployment Zone. She tried to photograph them, but one technician calmly turned his back to her camera and said, "You're not authorized to document internal systems. Please return to a safe distance." When she refused, he stepped forward, not aggressively but close enough that she could smell his cologne, and said, "Ma'am, I need you to disengage. This isn't your fight." It was the first time someone had used language that confirmed what she'd begun to suspect, that whatever was happening wasn't about drones, or parcel zoning, or even surveillance. This was part of a much larger operation, and her yard had become its anchor. She backed off, not because she was afraid of confrontation, but because she understood now that the game being played here had rules she didn't know, and opponents she couldn't see. Over the next few days, things escalated further. Her Wi-Fi became unstable, even when she switched routers and called in a technician. Devices in her home flickered, lost signal, rebooted spontaneously. Her security camera, installed near the shed, was pulled offline in the middle of the night. Her landlord, when she tried to speak with him directly, told her curtly that all concerns had to be routed through the management company. When she called the company again, they placed her on hold for 46 minutes before disconnecting the call. It was as if an invisible hand had begun slowly turning off every support structure around her. On a Thursday evening, she returned home after a long meeting with Warren and found the new platform covered with a tarp. Oddly, the tarp had been staked into the ground with steel pins and zip corded to her own fence. Whoever had done it hadn't even pretended to ask. She crouched near the edge and lifted the tarp just enough to see underneath. A fully enclosed housing unit with fans and blinking lights, a cooling vent that hissed quietly, and a blinking blue module with cellular antennas. This wasn't just a launch pad. It was a base station, possibly a relay node, possibly something worse. She went inside, sat down at her desk, and tried to suppress the rising panic. Then she opened the files Warren had sent her earlier, documents listing zoning appeals, filings from similar cases in other counties, and affidavits from residents whose properties had been repurposed for various logistical partnerships. Most were retired, renters, outliers, quiet types who didn't push back until it was too late. Nicole wasn't afraid of bureaucracy. She dissected it for a living. But this wasn't bureaucracy anymore. This was systemic violation under the guise of civic infrastructure. 2 days later, she discovered that someone had entered her yard while she was away. Her garden beds had been dug up, not destroyed, but rearranged. A row of small devices, no bigger than soda cans, had been placed just beneath the soil. She only discovered them because the edge of one protruded slightly after a rainstorm. When she pulled it out, it was warm, metallic, and marked with the same logo, Sinris. It had no serial number. She took it inside, placed it in a steel box, and called Warren immediately. He told her not to touch anything else, and he would contact a forensic tech. That night, Nicole didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., her motion sensor lights flared. She opened the blinds and saw nothing, then realized the shadows had changed. A figure was standing at the far end of the yard, just at the edge of the tree line. It wasn't one of the technicians. They weren't wearing a uniform. The person remained there, still as stone, before stepping backward and vanishing into the woods. No sound, no explanation, just presence. Cold and silent. She filed a police report the next morning. The officer who arrived was polite, middle-aged, and clearly uncomfortable. He took notes, asked if she had surveillance footage. She didn't, the camera was still offline, and told her he'd file the incident but that there wasn't much they could do unless it happened again. "People get lost in these neighborhoods all the time," he said. "Could have been a jogger or a surveyor." Nicole didn't argue. She just closed the door behind him and leaned against it, trying to keep her breathing steady. Her space was no longer hers. Her voice was being drowned by processes designed to wear her down. But she wasn't ready to quit. Not yet. And when she found the damaged drone tangled in her hedge the next afternoon, its camera module cracked and battery pack still hot, something inside her shifted. Not rage, not revenge, but resolve. Calm and precise. If they were going to use her property as a base, then they should prepare for what she was about to send back. Nicole spent the better part of the evening sitting cross-legged in her living room, the broken drone laid out in front of her on an old quilt she'd dragged from the hallway closet. She didn't take it apart recklessly. She wasn't a technician and didn't pretend to be. But she knew enough from years of academic research to understand the importance of evidence. The device was heavier than she expected, with a frame reinforced by carbon lattice and impact shielding around the lens. It wasn't something you picked up at a department store or found in a hobbyist's online cart. This was professional-grade equipment, built to fly silently, film steadily, and endure damage without compromising its data core. And though its outer shell was fractured, its central processing unit had remained intact, blinking softly as if aware it was being examined. She didn't try to hack it. That would have been foolish. Instead, she carefully removed the battery and stored both pieces separately in sealed containers, placed them in the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet, and double-locked it. Then she did what she did best. She started digging, not into the circuitry but the ownership trail. The drone bore no visible serial number, but one of the stabilizing rotors carried a faint logo pressed into the composite, a lowercase s woven through a hexagon. It was the same logo that had appeared on the flyers left by the men from Sinris. It wasn't a company she had ever encountered in her research or lectures, which was strange, especially for an entity claiming to operate logistics and aerial systems on a regional level. She ran a reverse image search, then followed a maze of links and old press releases until she found something useful. Sinris Logistics was not a government agency or a registered contractor with federal infrastructure programs. Instead, it was a privately held firm incorporated through a string of shell companies based in Nevada, with its primary address listed as a P.O. box. Its website was sleek, vague, and mostly marketing copy. Its listed services were broad: modular data coordination, community grid optimization, aerial telemetry augmentation. None of it meant anything, and that was the point. Their language had been designed to sound technical enough to dissuade scrutiny, but empty enough to deflect liability. Frustrated, but not surprised, Nicole copied every page she could find, archived the site, and sent it to Warren. When he called back, his tone was quieter than usual. He told her that one of his colleagues had previously investigated a similar entity operating under a different name in a different state, and that the common thread in those cases had been silence. Properties affected, residents intimidated or buried under paperwork, followed by rapid withdrawal once the location had served its purpose. "It's like they deploy, harvest, and vanish," he said, "and the damage they leave behind isn't physical. It's bureaucratic. No one's held accountable because no one can pin down who signed what." That was the moment Nicole realized she couldn't win this by appealing to systems built to ignore her. The policies, the protocols, the regulations, they were working as intended, just not for her. She needed a disruption, something that didn't rely on sympathy or waiting in queues, something symbolic but unmistakable. She turned back to the damaged drone. It took her 3 days to design and build what she called the payload, a compact device made from harmless components, a capsule filled with biodegradable glitter, a light-triggered dispersal mechanism, and a GPS tracker attached to a cloned signal. Beacon from the original drone. She wasn't trying to destroy anything. She wasn't planning sabotage. This wasn't revenge. It was message delivery. She calibrated the glitter capsule to rupture when the drone crossed back over the platform installed in her yard, sending a shimmering cloud across the surface and releasing a brief LED message, a red pulse that blinked one word: returned. The morning of the launch, she timed her steps like choreography. At 4:55 a.m., she opened the storage case, reattached the newly charged battery, and carefully positioned the modified drone on the edge of her patio, facing the platform. The neighborhood was still asleep, the streetlights humming faintly. The platform itself was dormant, waiting for its 5:47 cycle, and the technicians had not yet arrived. She activated the drone's controller, holding it steady in her palms, watching the rotors whir to life. It lifted, turned with robotic precision, and hovered briefly. Then she pushed it forward, guiding it directly toward the center of the platform. It touched down gently, its legs clicking against the steel surface. 5 seconds later, the capsule deployed. The effect was instant. A burst of silver-blue glitter exploded upward like confetti at a stadium event, catching in the wind and clinging to every surface of the platform. The blinking light began its loop, returned, 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 and then the drone shut down. Nicole didn't stay to watch what happened next. She turned around, walked inside, and closed the door. 2 hours later, the platform was gone. She didn't see who came to dismantle it. She didn't hear trucks. But when she stepped into the yard at 8 o'clock, the ground where the station had sat was bare, the soil newly tamped, the grass slightly uneven but undisturbed. The zip-tied signs had vanished. No residue. No tape. Not even a footprint. Nicole didn't celebrate. She knew better than to assume this meant victory, but she did feel something shift. Not in the yard, but inside herself. The silence that had filled her life for weeks now felt different. Not empty, but bracing. Like the moment after a storm passes and you realize the wind was trying to tell you something. That afternoon, she received an email from a no-reply address. No subject line, no greeting, just 2 words. Observed, logged. The next 48 hours passed in a state of hollow quiet. Nicole continued her routine, working from home, responding to students, and reviewing thesis submissions. But her focus had splintered. Her inbox remained free of any formal responses. No update from Warren, no communication from Sinris, no acknowledgement from any of the agencies she'd contacted. It was as if, by removing the platform, the operation had declared her no longer worth their time. But beneath that apparent withdrawal, Nicole sensed something else, an unsettling calm that didn't feel like a retreat. It felt like recalibration, like being watched from a greater distance. On the 3rd morning, she stepped outside to find a thick, sealed envelope on her doorstep. No stamp, no label, just a plastic sleeve and a single line typed across the front. Notice of compliance breach. Enforcement pending. Inside were copies of what appeared to be infractions. Photos of her backyard, satellite renderings, a list of timestamps when the platform access had been obstructed or tampered with, and, most disturbingly, a statement citing her for unregistered signal discharge during an active telemetry cycle, a reference to her glitter-filled drone payload. There was no formal logo, but at the bottom of the page was a narrow signature strip labeled S6E3 Liaison Authority. It was bureaucratic theater, nothing legal, nothing filed in any system, but it was structured like something real enough to scare, someone less persistent. She recognized it for what it was. Pressure, engineered to simulate official force without the weight of law. It wasn't just a threat, it was psychological warfare, an untraceable citation with the tone of a final warning. Nicole brought the letter to Warren, who grimaced as he skimmed it. They're testing boundaries again. This is intimidation in the shape of regulation. They're hoping you'll preemptively disengage, pull back before they escalate further. He advised her to file another complaint with the County Inspector General's office and with the FAA, attaching the materials for record. She did exactly that. But when she returned home, she noticed a drone parked under the eaves of her neighbor's roof, its lens tilted downward, aimed not at the street, but at her back window. It wasn't broadcasting. It was dormant. But she could see the indicator light. Blue, active, waiting. She called her neighbor to ask if they'd authorized any contractors or services. The neighbor, polite but cautious, said no, and then quickly ended the call. That evening, Nicole discovered that the fiber optic line to her house had been tampered with. The connection wasn't just degraded, it was cut and patched with what looked like a bypass cable, leading into a service box she didn't recognize. The ISP technician she convinced to come out on an emergency ticket confirmed it. "This isn't one of ours," he said, crouching beside the panel. "It looks like a directional splitter, probably rerouting your data through a local relay. But it's not tagged. That's not standard. This is black box stuff." He looked around nervously, then offered to install a temporary bypass line, but warned that he couldn't keep it on the books without triggering a service violation. Nicole agreed and tipped him in cash. Before he left, he muttered, "Whatever you're tangled in, I'd tread carefully." 2 nights later, her home was breached. Not physically, but psychologically. She returned from campus to find that nothing had been taken, nothing moved, no doors or windows forced open. But in the kitchen, the cupboard that held her tea had been left ajar, just slightly, and on the table was a photograph, a black and white printout of her sitting at her desk 2 weeks prior, clearly taken from an aerial perspective. There was no note, just the photo, and beside it, a broken piece of plastic casing from the drone she had modified. The implication was clear. They had been inside, and they had retrieved their device. The glitter message hadn't gone unnoticed. It had been interpreted as a provocation. The silence had not meant retreat. It had meant deliberation. Nicole didn't call the police. There was no proof of forced entry, and she knew the report would be dismissed. Instead, she doubled down. She installed a hardline analog camera system independent of her internet. She changed every lock and added reinforced door braces. She bought portable motion alarms, a battery-powered scanner, and sound masking equipment. She wasn't afraid. She was done being afraid. She understood now that what she was facing wasn't law, wasn't regulation, wasn't even surveillance in the traditional sense. It was a kind of territorial programming, an algorithmic reshaping of space, and she was the outlier, the unknown variable. The next escalation arrived at 4:15 a.m. Her motion sensors triggered, and the monitors blinked to life. On the screen, 3 individuals dressed in dark utility gear with reflective bands moved through her yard in a practice triangle. They weren't fumbling. They were methodical. One was placing beacons along the edge of her fence. Another scanned the ground with a handheld device. The third carried a black case which he opened to reveal a small, box-like mechanism with 4 antennae. Nicole activated the exterior lights. The trio froze, looked up, and then calmly collected their equipment before exiting through the east side gate. Within 90 seconds, they were gone. She sent the footage to Warren and the FAA. This time, she received a response not from a local agent, but from a federal compliance liaison who asked for a full statement. She was told a field investigator would follow up in person. It was the first real institutional engagement she had received, but it didn't stop what came next. Later that day, Nicole received a certified package. Inside was a legal complaint from a third-party entity, one she hadn't seen before, called North Frame Spatial Partners, accusing her of interfering with authorized public telemetry operations. The claim wasn't for money. It was for arbitration. They were trying to force her into a legal process outside of court, into a framework she didn't recognize, under rules she couldn't influence. Warren reviewed the documents and immediately filed a counter-notice of dispute. But the message was clear. They weren't trying to beat her in court. They were trying to exhaust her, mentally, emotionally, procedurally. The final trigger came not from Sinris or its faceless partners, but from within the community itself. An anonymous flyer began circulating among her neighbors, slipped into mailboxes and pinned to the community bulletin board. It read, "Tenant at 309B is actively interfering with infrastructure compliance. Disruptions may affect surrounding properties. Participation in unauthorized opposition may result in liability." Below, in smaller print, report concerns to regional oversight. She wasn't just isolated now. She was marked. No one spoke to her. Cars slowed when passing her driveway. She saw curtains shift when she walked past homes. One afternoon, a man walking his dog turned around abruptly and crossed the street without looking at her. The machinery had moved beyond her property. It was seeding distrust, suspicion. It was programming the environment. Nicole stood at her back window that night, watching the trees. She didn't know if another platform would appear, or if a signal would be activated, or if another team would arrive in silence to lay down unseen wires. But she did know one thing. This wasn't about her anymore. It never had been. She wasn't a target. She was a test. A controlled anomaly in a system built to erase friction. And whatever came next, she would not be the one to vanish quietly. The field investigator arrived 2 days later. His name was Elias Monroe, mid-40s, wearing a plain gray windbreaker and jeans, with no badge visible and no briefcase in hand. He introduced himself at the door with calm professionalism, offered a soft-spoken apology for the delay, and stepped inside with the polite deference of someone used to entering tense spaces. Nicole had cleaned the house obsessively the night before, not for appearances but to anchor herself, to remind herself that despite everything, this was still her home. Elias walked through each room slowly, taking mental notes rather than physical ones, pausing occasionally to glance out the windows, not just toward the yard, but toward the sky, as if mapping something larger than what was visible. When they reached the kitchen, Nicole offered him tea. He declined with a grateful smile and asked to see the footage. She showed him everything: the security recordings, the photo from the kitchen table, the copy of the citation letter, the anonymous flyer. He watched without interrupting, occasionally nodding, his face unreadable but not cold. When she was done, she asked the question she had been carrying for weeks. "Who are they?" Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he answered, choosing his words with surgical care. "What you're dealing with isn't an isolated case. It's part of a wider pattern of deployment involving privately contracted telemetry arrays operated under interim authorization procedures that have outpaced the legislation meant to govern them." He paused. "It's not illegal in the traditional sense, but it's not fully sanctioned either. The legal structure is behind the technology. The enforcement mechanisms are soft, designed to extract consent without asking for it directly. It's frictionless domination." He met her eyes. "What they've done here is wrong, but it's also been cleverly disguised as a series of minor infractions. You're not crazy. You're not overreacting. You were selected precisely because you were perceived as unlikely to resist." Nicole sat back, exhaling through her nose. "What happens now?" Elias folded his hands. "I've submitted a formal breach report. It will trigger an internal audit and likely halt further on-site deployments. But you need to understand, this doesn't stop the operation. It just redirects it elsewhere. These systems are modular. The next property is probably already tagged." Nicole was silent for a long moment. "So, that's it? They move on, and I just wait to see if they come back?" He hesitated. "No. You use what you've documented. Make it matter." That night, she did exactly that. She prepared a full data packet: footage, correspondence, drone fragments, timestamps, legal filings. She removed all names. She removed her voice. She stripped the story down to signal alone. One voice among many. She sent it to journalists, university contacts, tech policy analysts, even a civil liberties watchdog group she once guest lectured for. She didn't wait for replies. It wasn't about reaction. It was about pressure, turning what had been done to her into weight, something heavy enough to shift the equilibrium. But Sinris hadn't gone dark yet. That same evening, as she stood in her yard inspecting the scar where the relay platform had once been, a low hum returned to the air. Not a drone. A vehicle. A black van rolled slowly down the street and stopped across from her house. No lights. No markings, just parked, sitting, idling. She stepped forward, arms crossed, and stared directly at it. No one emerged. No one spoke. After 4 minutes, it reversed without signaling, turned the corner, and vanished into the dark. The next morning, she received a letter via courier. It was thicker than the last, on heavier paper. No logo. No return address. Inside was a single paragraph printed in bold font. Further engagement will be interpreted as hostile interference. Distribution of restricted materials may result in formal redress. Terminate exposure pathways. Compliance is preferred. She smiled. That afternoon, she returned to the shed and began her final preparation. She had kept one drone operational, salvaged, repurposed, and rebuilt, with guidance from one of her students who specialized in UAV telemetry systems. The student had no idea what it was for, only that it had to be silent, stable, and capable of reverse GPS mimicry. Nicole loaded the drone with a new capsule. Not glitter this time, but a burst charge of ultraviolet paint, detectable under specific spectrums, designed to mark objects and surfaces without immediate visual trace. She had calculated the coordinates from Elias's offhand remark about modular redirection, and identified a property 2 blocks away that had been vacant for months, but recently showed signs of external wiring and unlisted power fluctuations. That night, just after 3 a.m., she launched the drone silently over the rooftops and brought it to hover 30 feet above the suspected relay station. She deployed the capsule. The burst was invisible but effective. The paint would settle onto the antennae and hardware. Days later, when federal tech analysts conducted a sweep prompted by the growing attention Nicole's file had generated, they would find the marks. They would trace the equipment to Sinris, to its parent holding, to the shell companies, and eventually to the private infrastructure group contracted by an unlisted regional development board operating far beyond its original mandate. The dominoes began to fall faster than anyone expected. Journalists picked up the story. Whistleblowers emerged, quiet voices who had seen too much and were now willing to speak. Lawsuits were filed. Preliminary injunctions were granted. By the end of the month, Sinris Logistics had shut down all active platforms across the state. Their website went offline. Their P.O. boxes closed. Their digital trace thinned into silence. Nicole was never contacted again. Not by Sinris, not by its successors. The black van never returned. Her data was cited in hearings. Her drone footage was shown in closed-door briefings. And, through it all, she said nothing publicly. She refused interviews. She declined to become a symbol. She had no interest in being the face of anything. What had happened to her wasn't unique. It was just the first to be seen. And that, she decided, was enough. Spring came late that year, as if nature itself had hesitated to trust the world again. The trees around Nicole's house bloomed unevenly, branches sprouting with hesitant buds, some still locked in winter's grip. She took her time re-inhabiting the space that had once been her own in name only. The backyard, once an open wound, slowly transformed again, not by force, but by intention. She removed the last of the warning signs, not because she believed the danger had passed entirely, but because she refused to let them dictate the language of her home. The grass grew wild for a time, then trimmed back into shape under her own schedule. The garden beds, once rearranged without her consent, were rebuilt in new patterns she chose deliberately, unexpected, uneven, resistant to symmetry. The motion sensors remained. So did the cameras, the hardwired power backups, and the analog alarm triggers. Nicole didn't remove the security infrastructure. She simply changed its purpose. It was no longer a system designed to detect intruders. It was a memory architecture, a reminder of the boundaries she had been forced to redraw. She never saw another drone, no more vans, no more technicians appearing with bureaucratic folders or glossy flyers. The silence, at last, felt clean. Warren kept her updated sporadically. Sinris had dissolved officially, but splinters of the entity had begun to reappear under different names, different licenses, different domains. It was a hydra, he told her once, cut off a head and another rose, slightly modified with better shielding. But the difference now was scrutiny. People were watching. Legal protocols were being amended. Loopholes closed, hearings scheduled with an urgency that hadn't existed before. Her case had become the unofficial benchmark, a precedent whispered through offices and inboxes with the cautious reverence usually reserved for landmark events. She never sought credit, never asked for her name to be mentioned. She requested only that the documentation remain intact, accessible, undeniable. Students began to ask different questions in her lectures. Less about urban theory and more about the spaces between infrastructure and power, about who gets to decide what land becomes valuable, and what happens when that value is extracted without acknowledgement. Nicole never spoke about her experience directly, but traces of it emerged in the way she phrased things, in the case studies she highlighted, in the long pauses she took when discussing the fragility of consent. Her neighbors, for the most part, returned to their routines. A few offered belated nods when passing, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. She let them choose. One of them, a young couple who had moved in just months before the worst of it, left a small box of seedlings at her doorstep. No note, just a quiet gesture of restoration. She planted them along the perimeter where the relay station had once stood. They took root quickly. There were days when she still felt the hum in the air. Not sound. Memory. A kind of residual charge that lived in the mind more than the body. She learned to breathe through it, to let it pass without naming it. Other days, she walked the edge of her property line, not to patrol, but to remember. There was power in remembrance, she'd learned. Power in refusing to forget even when the world wanted you to move on. On the first true warm day of the season, Nicole hosted a gathering. Not large, not celebratory. Just a few colleagues, a few students, a pot of coffee on the back table, fresh bread, and a chalkboard leaning against the gazebo, where she wrote a single sentence. Ownership is not presence. Presence is not control. Control is not consent. No one needed to ask what it meant. They understood. As dusk fell and the last of her guests departed, Nicole stood alone in the yard, watching the trees catch the fading light. There were no wires, no devices, no cameras hidden in shadows. Just air, just space. She exhaled slowly. And then, smiling faintly to herself, she walked inside and closed the door behind her. Not to shut anything out, but because she could.